Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathleen Holscher. I'm Associate Professor of Religious Studies and American Studies, and I hold the Endowed Chair of Roman Catholic Studies here at UNM. Today, I want to begin by recognizing not only that UNM sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, but also that the national laboratories here, including Los Alamos, are on the lands that both Native and Hispano peoples in New Mexico have called home. Welcome to the public final event in our forum on nuclear strategy that we're calling Disarmament and Deterrence in a Dangerous World, co-organized by the Institute of Advanced Catholic Studies at University of Southern California, the Religious Studies program at UNM, and myself as the Catholic Studies Chair. The world is dangerous because we make it that way through the creation and maintenance of nuclear weapons. The current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, tells us that nuclear weapons are ethically abhorrent and that it is wrong for nations, including the United States, to maintain nuclear stockpiles, even if it's for the purpose of deterring attacks. The Pope has called for encounter and dialogue, not only between nuclear states, but also within those states. That includes international organizations, religious communities, and civil society to, in his words, work with determination to promote the conditions necessary for a world without nuclear arms. And this forum brings together religious and secular voices in an effort to take up that call. I want to get us started by introducing three people. First, we'll hear a bit from the Archbishop of Santa Fe, John Wester. He'll come offer a welcome. 2 years ago, Archbishop Wester wrote a pastoral letter that brought the Pope's urgent call for nuclear disarmament to the U.S. Catholic Church and here to New Mexico in particular. And then we'll hear from the Most Reverend Joseph Matsuaki Takami, the Catholic Archbishop Emeritus of Nagasaki, Japan, and a hibakusha survivor of the U.S. bomb dropped on Nagasaki, and Regis Pecos, the former governor of Cochiti Pueblo. Both Takami and Pecos will offer short opening reflections for us rooted in their own traditions. Archbishop Wester.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm extremely grateful to you and to Richard Wood, Dr. Wood, to both of you for facilitating this wonderful forum and all the hard work that you and your collaborators have put in, and Avalon from our own archdiocese and so many others who have worked so hard on this. Thank you very, very much. And welcome and thank you to all of you who are present here today. Your presence is very important to us and we're very grateful that you're here. Yesterday and then this morning, we've been privileged to hear from many points of view on the questions of nuclear deterrence and multilateral, verifiable nuclear disarmament. And actually, we've gone well beyond that paradigm. I'm pleased to say that this has been and will be this afternoon an example of Albuquerque breaking good, if you know what I mean. I am convinced that when reasonable and goodwill people entered into a critical conversation regarding nuclear weapons, progress can be made toward their elimination. Thus, this has been anything but a rearmament forum. I'm grateful to Cardinal Robert McElroy of San Diego, to Archbishop Emeritus Takami, to Dr. Thomas Mason, the current director of Los Alamos National Laboratories, and to Dr. Sig Hecker, past director, to Dr. Helfand of Physicians for Social Responsibility, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, and Back from the Brink, and many, many others who've been part of our conversation these days, who've had the courage to address this vital issue from their point of view. This is precisely what we're trying to stimulate when we released our letter in January of 1922, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. While the issue of nuclear disarmament can be approached from many angles, say militarily or politically, The one lens that I believe must never be omitted is that of the human person. That is why the presence of Archbishop Takami and his good friend Dr. Masao Tomonaga has been so critical to our proceedings. They are both Hibakusha, that is, survivors of the nuclear attack on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945 at 11:01 a.m. They're living examples of the need to abolish nuclear weapons. The Archbishop was in his mother's womb on August 9th of that day when a plutonium bomb from Los Alamos, New Mexico flattened his city, ironically destroying the largest Catholic community in Japan. And Dr. Tomonaga barely missed being burned to death in a building that collapsed minutes after his mother rescued him. They both give witness to all those who perished when that bomb fell so long ago. T.S. Eliot said that the communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. The Archbishop and the doctor have courageously echoed that language ever since 1945, and we ignore them at our own peril. A year ago in Nagasaki, on the 78th anniversary of its atomic bombing, Archbishop Takami and I, along with the Archbishop of Seattle, the Archbishop of Nagasaki, and the Bishop of Hiroshima, formed the Partnership for a World Without Nuclear Weapons to work on nuclear disarmament. I pray that this partnership, which is already growing, will include many other dioceses and Catholic institutions and others beyond the Catholic Church, so that we also will add to the voices of the Hibakusha. My pastoral letter traced the evolution of Catholic thought regarding nuclear weapons, culminating in Pope Francis's declaration that the possession itself of nuclear weapons is immoral. But I'm going to let Cardinal McElroy speak to that in a moment as he gives us a brief précis of what we talked about in our days. He is one of the brightest minds that I know, and he summarizes very beautifully the Church's position on this matter. We have others here as well who are going to speak to us today. Very briefly, I take note that Monsignor Hare is with us, J. Brian Hare of Boston, who has been at this for a long, long time in the Catholic Church. We're very privileged to have him with us here today. And so with that now, I'd like to turn it over to Archbishop Takami for an opening reflection, and then to Regis Pecos. Again, welcome to all, both physically here and those who are online, or I should say streaming, I suppose. May we all contribute to a future world free of nuclear weapons. I close by saying, onward to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 2025. Whether in person or in spirit, we want to hold world leaders accountable for concrete progress toward nuclear disarmament by the 80th bombing anniversaries. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Joseph Takami, Archbishop Emeritus of Nagasaki. I am an atomic bomb survivor, Hibakusha, from Nagasaki. I was exposed to radiation in the womb of my mother. Hibakusha, like myself and Dr. Tomonaga, here present, are rapidly aging. As of this year, the total number of Hibakusha in Japan is 106,825, including 25,966 in Nagasaki. All we hope is that nuclear weapons will not be used ever again. Together with peace activists and younger people like high school students, we have long called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Despite all our efforts, however, the political leaders of the nuclear weapons states are not listening, and the critical situation regarding nuclear weapons has not changed at all. On the contrary, the situation is getting worse. Nevertheless, we Hibakusha and all those who stand with us continue to appeal for the abolition of nuclear weapons and will never cease our efforts. We demand that the nuclear weapons states, Russia, the US, China, and other countries, have a deep awareness of their responsibility for protecting irrepressible human lives. They have an immense role to play in the abolition of nuclear weapons. These weapons are made by human hands to kill other fellow human beings, and therefore have no place on the planet and should not exist. The United States of America and other countries that have used nuclear weapons or conducted nuclear tests need to recognize the detrimental health and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. The political leaders must end their dependence on nuclear deterrence. My question is, how many more people should suffer from the production of nuclear weapons? These states should reflect deeply on their actions and take responsibility for them. The most practical penance for the use and the testing of nuclear weapons would be the signing and ratification of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. At the same time, instead of investing in the production and development of nuclear weapons, they should make use of their immense resources and wealth to restore the polluted and destroyed environment and to eradicate poverty. All people and all nations must always strive to have relationships based not on economic or political domination, but on justice, truth, mutual trust, and love. We must promote peace, education, and dialogue. Thank you very much.
Kuatsehopa is a greeting in my given language of the people of Cochiti. I'm going to ask you all to stand and share this moment in this time as I offer a prayer, because my reflections will be deeply embedded in this prayer. And I'm going to share this with all of you here today with what we as Pueblo people were gifted to pray with, and that is with our mother corn. It is how we continue to connect with all those who've gone before us. It is how we call them into these spaces of this very nature of this dialogue, honoring those who have gone before us, the past, appreciating all of us today in the present, to open our minds and open our hearts as we deliberate to answer the question of what do we want future generations to inherit from us. And so with that, asish asha ushachanush kudstil, tseum kuhu hok eishimi mani karstil and tuna you eat a church eight show new ouch go money. Got do it yit the put ni kut ni hat ni. Seo at the hat the troopers to my Zeha Zapo Marshan ya which on it go there's gunners kaskawinska. eight shall new hours go money. Go at the heart, it's the hour down, eight good. Han go eat was cartridge in. At the whole heart, the arm new hours go money. At the ish shakana iani. Not it's the sujuste. Amo no trust sujuste. Do see you. Hat it see amo me nations you tau da. Got me your hat me go hat it tune go here go puno. Hat it see ishraps iani. As we end this prayer, we always put our hands out, if you will, and bring them to your mouth and inhale. That is how we share the breath of life common to all of our existence. Thank you. You may be seated. Our elders teach us that the gifts of the Creator, how to live, how to be, through the gift of the preciousness of language, that allows us to find purpose in our life, is the Creator's gift to us, our language, our lands, our way of life, our laws, our governance, our families, our communities, and all living life as a gift to sustain us for our well-being physically, spiritually, and mentally. And the original instructions of the gifts of our Creator defines our way of life. And our elders teach us core values with which to guide our lives. And in the work that I do, engaging people in some of the most complex conflicts, I always use those teachings to ask everyone engaged in dialogue, what is your core value that defines who you are, that defines what you do, and defines why you do what you do? And then to ask who gifted you that core value. Because our elders teach us that the gift of our core values is the deepest expression of their love for us. It is what they say will guide our lives long after they return to our Creator. It is a gift that they hope and pray will be our gift to our children. Hope and pray that that would be the gift to the grandchildren. And as the elders teach us, to live your life guided by your core values is how you honor those who gifted you that core value. And core values, they say, will guide you to make the right decision always, because they teach that core values will never lie to you. And so that is what guides us in our way of life as gifted to us by the Creator. And by all measurements and by all accounts, this very discussion of the disturbance of a spirit in this world that is the basis with which the nuclear industry survives in tapping that resources, that as elders prophesied, when we shake loose that spirit from the Mother Earth, there will be nothing in this world that will contain that spirit. And by all measurements and accounts, this is a representation of the viciousness of the doctrines of discovery, of manifest destiny, that bred the right to colonize people around the world in the name of Christianity. We, as other peoples in this world are still subject to that. This is a perpetuation of the worst of the doctrines of discovery and supremacy. But I am thankful, as we have engaged Archbishop, always an honor to be in your presence, and other people of faith, our mentors, our teachers, that our Father, Pope Francis, repudiated the doctrines of discovery. And we have learned the same from our Archbishop here. But our elders teach us to be mindful, to always think, are the decisions we're making today strengthening our core values for the maintenance of balance and harmony with all living things, that we are but a small part in this larger ecosystem? Or are the decisions we're making driving us further away from our core values? It is our experience as indigenous peoples since the introduction of this development and in this process that it is one of the most cruelest examples in our modern history that those gifted to by our Creator to live in balance and in harmony have been the people who have been viciously the subjects of the perpetuation of the kind of racism and discrimination that comes with fulfilling the principles of supremacy. And in this pursuit of power, our elders teach us, as our gifts from our Creator, in the reconciliation of Catholicism as a process of colonization, we are deeply blessed that in that reconciliation has been the convergence of our own traditional faith with Catholicism, and that our reflections are deeply embedded in that faith. But we have been subjected in the worst way, as was prophesied by our elders, that when others deviate from our core values, the ultimate threat for the maintenance of our own will be our greatest challenge in our survival. And that is the reality we live daily. I come from Cochiti, just down below Los Alamos, and we see the way in which this industry continues to poison the gifts of the Creator, the spirit of all life giver, water, the way in which it poisons the land, poisons the air we breathe, poisons the vegetation, poisons the food cycle and chain that we consume. That is the most fundamental deviation. And in the dialogue before, today, after, if we're not mindful that in further discussions that we are not inclusive of all people from all walks of life, then we must ask ourselves, are we contributing to the maintenance of our core values by being inclusive? Or are we perpetuating the underpinnings of racism by not being inclusive? And if that is the truth, then we are consciously or unconsciously contributing to our demise. Our elders teach us that in the fulfillment of our way of life, guided by the deep common core values of our faith, for the maintenance of peace, for the maintenance as an outcome of justice, that this discussion fundamentally creates the challenge that the most powerful country in this world has defined itself all over the world as the major contradiction of its own principles. That in the name of peace, it is perpetuating our slow death. Because in this whole continuum of development of nuclear arms, just as we see daily downstream from the biggest footprint here in New Mexico, we see the slow death of all of the gifts of Creator to us for the maintenance of the balance and harmony of all life. It is poisoning all of the gifts given to us to sustain a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And if we have not learned from the horrific tragedies of our brothers and sisters in Nagasaki, in Hiroshima, that is the ultimate end. But on this other end of the spectrum, we are all subject to the slow death that culminates in that horrific example that we have not learned from. And as the elders teach us, if we do not learn from the hard lessons of our lived experiences, we are surely going to all die by it. And it's always the prayer that I shared with all of you here today. Let us continue to be guided by our deep faith, that engagement in a conscious way open our minds and open our hearts to continue this necessary discussion, shared by the commonness of the values of our faith, of peace, that born out of that is justice. And as this sign reads, if you are engaged in the business of war, you are the enemy of peace. And for every conscious person, there is no rationalization, there is no argument that will ever prevail, that what this country and others around the world are engaged in the name of peace will always end up the opposite, and that is war. And what we should continue to work for collectively in our shared values is toward peace and justice in this world. And this is a necessary part of the process, but I beg you that this process of dialogue the last few days, today and moving forward, be inclusive of far more people who are representing the communities of color, or we're perpetuating the underpinnings of racism, of supremacy, by not inclusive. That is the mindset that we must strive to break from, so that the decisions comes from here to here and not from here to here. And so I thank all of you, and as I ended my prayer and blessings today, appreciating in gratitude all of you being here on a Saturday afternoon. Just that there is something that the elders also share, and that is the ministry of presence. That just by you taking the time to be here is a very meaningful part of the collective spirit that we share. That is the ministry of presence that our elders say that when someone calls you, it's giving you value that by your mere presence here today speaks volumes of your consciousness to contribute in the best way you can, even as you sit there quiet and listen, that has incredible value, the spirit of your presence. And I share it with you that when we bless one another by bringing together all those who've walked upon this land, who in their time breathed the same air that we breathe, that when we bring that to our mouths to inhale, it is giving the ultimate value to the shared spirit of our humanity, that we as individuals are but a small part of this larger ecosystem dependent in the balance and harmony for our well-being. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Governor Emeritus Regis Pecos, Archbishop Emeritus Takami, and Archbishop Lester. I'm Richard Wood. I'm the president of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies and a professor of sociology here at UNM, born and raised in New Mexico. It's great to be here. Buenas tardes y tsengita amo. I want to just say a little bit about background rules for the day and just a shortest bit on background of the last days of dialogue. Intention of this effort is to bring together people of a wide variety of views about something that I think we all had consensus on, which was avoiding nuclear Armageddon. The hard question is how best to do that. And what we had in the room was 24, 26 people of quite different views about that, in a very, very frank conversation about how best to do that, and to try to ground that conversation both in the kind of big picture geopolitical world, but also in the realities of what it means in New Mexico for New Mexico communities, and do all that across a range of views. We intend this afternoon to be a sort of, in part, a public report out from that conversation, as well as a chance to engage with representatives from New Mexico communities and with all of you to think together about this question of the nuclear present and what the future might hold. To allow that to work well, we have some ground rules for the conversation. We'll have some very brief report outs from the set of experts out of the policy world, out of the academic world, out of the religious world, out of New Mexico communities, invited to report out their own experience out of the conversation. In gathering this group, the commitment is that it's a conversation out of, in order for people to be honest and frank, they have to feel like it's a confidential conversation. So we're asking people not to report on what other people said, but to report their own experience of the dialogue. Another ground rule is that during the interchange with the audience, in order to give as many of you as possible to ask questions, make statements, that we'll limit each person to 2 minutes. We'll use this as a way to signal that. It'll count 2 minutes, turn yellow, and then you'll have about 30 seconds to wrap up. It'll turn red at that point. And at that point, you need to finish, and we'll move on to the next commentator. The experts who will be reflecting with you will also have 2 minutes to respond, and so that they don't dominate the room either. Other ground rules, we've decided not to have a break, so that instead, one ground rule is that any of you, like I, may need to step out of the back of the room and go to the restroom, and that's allowed. Okay, so those are our ground rules. If I could please invite Archbishop, Robert Cardinal McElroy, Bishop of San Diego, Rose Gottemuller, and who else is coming up? Ira Helfand, and Michael Desh, please. Thank you. And I'm going to ask each of you as you speak to please introduce yourself. And everyone has access to the full biographies of folks here, so we're not going to spend time going through folks' full biographies. Please look those up. They're available online and in writing. And if I could ask each of you to just give a very quick kind of what the one line of your biography that is most relevant to this conversation. And we'll go in the order Cardinal McElroy, former Undersecretary Rose Gottemuller, Dr. Ira Helfand, and Dr. Michael Desh. And they'll each just report out from their own experience of the dialogue. Then if anybody else out of the dialogue group would like to come forward, we'll do that. And then we'll move into the next session. Cardinal McElroy.
Sure. I'm the Catholic Bishop of San Diego, and I've done work over the years in moral theology and on public policy. A significant part of the dialogue touched upon ethical questions and specifically drew from the statements on Catholic teaching from the various popes, and particularly the statement of Pope Francis on the possession of nuclear weapons. And there has been a long tradition that really has come through the whole of the nuclear age in which Catholic teaching has confronted the reality of nuclear weapons and all of the terrible consequences that they brought into our world. And basically, there were two major elements of that teaching. The first is all through this period of time of the nuclear age, Catholic teaching has pointed to the need for the abolition of nuclear weapons. The second is, during this period of time, how can policymakers, how can societies move from the possession of nuclear weapons to an abolition of nuclear weapons in a responsible way that's not destabilizing. Pope John Paul II, Pope John the 23rd in Pacem Terris said, both of these elements, that is the abolition, need to be in front of us, and also the sense deterrence serves a role that is limited in society as we move toward disarmament. And there's been that interplay all through Catholic teaching. Pope John Paul II in the 1980s said, because we live in a world which is filled with such dangers in how we move forward on nuclear weapons, that an interim ethic of deterrence is acceptable in a strictly conditioned manner as a step on the road to disarmament. So it was strictly conditioned, and it was a way directed toward disarmament, how to get there safely and responsibly. Pope Francis, in 2017, moved the teaching in the interplay of those two factors to say the conditions for that interim ethic are not being fulfilled at the current moment, and thus the possession of nuclear weapons by societies is morally illicit. The interim ethic no longer holds, in other words, because the conditions under which it was allowed have not been taking place and observed. So what does that mean? This was a lot of the discussion that we had. One thing it does not mean of the new statement on Pope Francis, it is not a judgment on the actions of particular individuals. That's very important. And it was a very neuralgic issue in our discussions, that it is not a judgment on individual action, because it's very understandably troubling to people at all levels working in the nuclear programs and the labs, military men and women, the notion that because the possession is illicit now,
that therefore their actions are morally objectionable. That is not what this teaching means. And so, but there was divergence in the room on how we move responsibly forward in doing this, in reaching abolition. And some thought that the deterrence is necessary for the long term, that we can't say it can be dispensed with at any period of time. And others felt that we need to move rapidly toward the elimination of nuclear weapons, and to do so safely. But in a difficult world, we need to move rapidly. And the Pope's statement, I think, on this was a recognition and a conclusion that the urgency of that has been lost sight of in the world. Thus, societies which possess nuclear weapons, that action is morally illicit for societies to possess nuclear weapons. And we need to move away from that in a way that is responsible, but in an urgent manner. So those were a lot of the ethical issues that came up, and I think others will speak to them.
Thank you, Cardinal McElroy. Rose Gottmuller, former Undersecretary for Arms Control in the U.S. Department of State.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be on this beautiful campus of UNM. I've never been here before because usually I've been at either Sandia or Los Alamos and not on the university campus as Undersecretary. You know, I've made it my professional life to bring us along the road toward nuclear disarmament. We have a great, in my view, 50-year history, starting with the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement in 1972, following on the threat of near annihilation that we experienced in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. 10 years later, we worked and agreed to the first agreement with the Soviet Union to limit and control nuclear weapons. And following that, there was a 50-year history culminating in the negotiation and entry into force of the New START Treaty in 2011. And therefore, I have to tell you quite honestly, I do disagree somewhat with the Pope. I say that with some trepidation, I must say. But I do think that we have had a history of honest and hard work on the nuclear disarmament agenda for 50 years. The trouble is now it has been interrupted because President Putin, the Russian president, President Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, they are simply saying nowadays, no more talking. No more talking until you do what we want to do in a completely different area. President Putin says you must stop assisting Ukraine. President Xi Jinping says you must stop assisting Taiwan. And to my mind, that is the strangest thing because nuclear weapons are such an existential threat to humanity that we must continue to work to reduce and limit them and control them, no matter what other issues are affecting our relationship with these countries. So we did have a spirited discussion of this matter because my current argument is that, in fact, the work that many at the labs are doing to advance modernization under the program of record of the U.S. Department of Energy and U.S. government, this work is creating the conditions to finally bring Russia and China back to the negotiating table. And I have to tell you, we have had a spirited argument about this in our group, with some saying, why are you modernizing even under the limits of the New START Treaty, which is what the program of record is? It's a limited modernization, not to build up, not to increase, but to build and modernize in a way that will enable us to have a safe, secure, and effective arsenal for as long as nuclear weapons exist. This was President Obama's insistence when he launched the program of record almost 10 years ago now. So my view is that the work that is being done in this modernization program, in fact, is creating the conditions that will bring Russia and China to the negotiating table again. But we did have a very spirited discussion. Some of my colleagues may wish to speak to that. And in the end of the day, I will only recount to you the precedent that I think makes this a reality, this notion. And that is, in 1979, when the Soviets were deploying intermediate-range missiles in Europe, in a way that was threatening our NATO allies, NATO and the United States together agreed to deploy intermediate range missiles in Europe, the so-called dual track decision, deploy missiles with the incentive then being to push the USSR back to the negotiating table. And that is exactly what happened. We ended up with the so-called INF Treaty in 1987 banning such weapons. So I think we need to be thinking in those terms. What will incentivize the Russians and the Chinese today to come back and talk to us about continuing along this road to nuclear disarmament? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Dr. Ira Helfand from the steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Good afternoon. As my good friend Rose Gottmuller said, there were some spirited disagreements in this discussion, and that was very good because I come to this conversation from the perspective that we need to eliminate nuclear weapons urgently, that we are on the brink of nuclear war, and that if we don't get rid of these weapons soon, they're going to get rid of us. And I believe it's possible to get rid of these weapons if we decide we're going to do that. I disagree with the notion that the United States has pursued this course up until now. I think it has made significant efforts to try to control the arms race, to try to keep things from getting completely out of control. But I don't think the United States has ever been committed to the elimination of nuclear weapons. I think it has been the intention of the United States government to maintain this arsenal indefinitely. And I think that has to change. I don't think that the responsibility for this lies solely with the United States. I think that we do need to bring the Russians and the Chinese back into dialogue, and they have not been willing to do that. But I disagree with the approach that the way to do that is to threaten them with more weapons. I think that we need to approach them with the rational argument that the continued existence of nuclear weapons threatens the existence of all of our countries, and that it is in their interest to eliminate their arsenals in an organized, controlled, time-bound way with the United States so that none of us have to worry about these weapons being used. Secretary Gottmuller just referred to the decision by the United States to place missiles in Europe in the 1980s and talked about how that brought the Russians back to the negotiating table. It also led on 2 occasions to our coming within minutes of nuclear war. And I think that there's a real argument that can be made that this is not the safest way to try to move forward. We need to sit down with the Russians and the Chinese to the extent that we can. We need to approach them with a different argument, not that we want to limit their weapons and our weapons, but that we want to get rid of them. And we want to work out with them what is necessary to do that. And as I said, I don't think this has been the approach ever of the United States government, and I think it is what the approach needs to be. And I think citizens have an important role to play in this. Here in the United States, we've organized a campaign called Back from the Brink to try to bring pressure on the United States government to adopt this approach to the nuclear problem. And I think that it is the responsibility of citizens in a democracy to be part of this conversation, to play an active role in this decision-making, to not leave it to the experts, and to make their wishes known. And so I would encourage you all to participate in this process and to join the Back from the Brink campaign and help the United States government adopt a different and I think more productive way of leading to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Helfand. Thank you all four. We have 2 more of our guests who'd like to say a little bit, reporting out from the conversations. Marianne Cusimano-Love, Professor, oh, sorry, I skipped Michael Desch, pardon me. Hold on, we'll come to you in just a second. I had checked that box in my head. I would like to introduce Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Michael Hesch, pardon me.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you who came out on a Saturday afternoon to spend time talking about weighty issues like this, rather than, as I would be doing if I were home, watching college football. You're better people than I am. The conversations we had were really terrific, and they ranged from sort of the wonky nuts and bolts of nuclear strategy and arms control to the more philosophical and even theological. And at one point, somebody opined that the effort to harness the atom in a way was sort of like man's effort to become like God. I thought that was very profound, and there's more than an element of truth in that. The question is how one would think about that effort. Would one think trying to become godlike like that is blasphemous? You know, that perspective could come from certain faith traditions. But I was thinking there's another way to think about it. The movie Oppenheimer, which was based on a biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Robert Sherwin, the title of the book was American Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan, a demigod in Greek mythology who brought fire to man, brought a god's substance to man. Now, Prometheus was not a blasphemer, but a tragic figure. And for the Greeks, tragedy often involved really talented, really well-intentioned individuals who, for some reason, maybe a small character flaw, ended up coming a cropper of what they were trying to accomplish. I see the nuclear age more in the context of tragedy than blasphemy. Dr. Einstein's remarks, I think, are illustrative of the tragedy. Einstein felt in 1939 that the possibility that Nazi Germany would get ahead of the Allies in the development of atomic weapons presented an existential threat that required what became the Manhattan Project. And I think his judgment was the right one at the time. But the consequences of that, also had important downsides. And so I think the way for me to think about the nuclear age is in the realm of Greek tragedy, where good motives and great talent have mixed results. Thank you very much.
Marianne and Hiro, could you come up as well, please? Yeah, please. Next will be Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love, a professor of international relations at Catholic University of America.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to be part of this, and thanks for inviting us to view the beauty of New Mexico and the beauty of your people, most of all. I had a little different perspective on these issues than some of my colleagues, and that is focusing on change. Change is the only constant in international politics, and change today is fast, intense, broad, and deep. We have more people on planet Earth than ever before. We have more countries on planet Earth than ever before. And believe it or not, we have fewer wars, even though there are still horrific wars in places like Ukraine, Russia, and Gaza, Israel. This means we need more cooperation than ever before in human history to face these problems that, like those presented by nuclear weapons. And luckily, I believe we have what it takes to do that. There are more ways to establish peace now than ever before. We've seen the expansion of peace with the expansion of greater economic prosperity. We've seen the expansion of peace with greater democratization. And we've also seen the expansion of peace with tried and true methods in places around the world, from Ireland to the Philippines to Colombia, where places that were seen as tragic conditions of hopeless conflicts have been able to establish more peaceful societies. by building stronger relationships, by having more inclusive participation of people and communities, by building right relationships, by having more information and sharing of information, and by more attention to the sustainability, our relationships with our environment and with future generations. All of these provide really important ways forward to peace. And I think all of that is really possible for us to practice on these issues of nuclear weapons. I would just close by saying that nuclear weapons have a way of making us feel helpless and hopeless. And that is not accurate. Those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness are profoundly at odds with our Christian DNA. But they're also profoundly at odds with our democratic DNA, which is that when we come together as people from very pluralistic and diverse backgrounds, we have a can-do idea of how we can work together for the common good and how we can bring about and innovate, invent, and create new solutions to even very challenging problems. People invented atomic weapons. We, as communities, can invent our ways out of the challenges they bring. It's not easy, but it's absolutely possible. So I would encourage everybody. I felt very energized by the exchange of viewpoints. We need all hands on deck to address issues as challenging. And I want to thank the organizers and New Mexico, the University of New Mexico and others for giving us the chance to prove the point of the polarization of our politics being blocking the chances for these types of conversations, and that we were able to come together across very different viewpoints and have very collegial, very productive, very respectful chances to try to talk about ways to move the issue forward. So thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Hiro Miyazaki, Professor of Anthropology from Northwestern University.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm Hiro Miyazaki, a professor of anthropology at Northwestern, but I also serve as a peace correspondent for the city of Nagasaki. So I came to this gathering with one question. Where can we find hope in this policy discussion of nuclear security? Fear is everywhere in this conversation, from fear embedded in the notion of nuclear deterrence to fear experienced by hibakusha atomic bomb survivors and downwinders and other people that were affected by nuclear testing. They live in constant fear. And our conversation started with Archbishop Takami's prayer and very powerful testimony. And as also today, we deeply appreciated Archbishop Emeritus Takami's remarks and also former Governor Regis Pecco's very powerful prayer and remark, really touching. And I think I found hope in this conversation. That's my report. And one of the areas where I found hope is a kind of beginning of finding an answer to this very difficult question of how to relate hypothetical future harm nuclear war may cause on this planet to existing past and ongoing harms caused by nuclear weapons that disproportionately affected people of color around the globe. So when there was, as I said, there was a testimony from Archbishop Emeritus Takami, and also there was an excellent presentation on local nuclear injuries, nuclear justice issues in New Mexico. And I think those testimonies and presentations really moved lots of participants. And there was an interesting, very concrete suggestion made, which really inspired me. perhaps international community of affected people affected by nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons use and also testing, to work together with policymakers and state-level negotiators to finally end nuclear testing permanently. And that is one area where I can see hope, glimmer of hope. And we need to find other areas where we can bring policymakers and high-level conversations on nuclear security and nuclear justice issues together. And also, in a somewhat more mundane way, I found hope in this conversation. I made a few new friends, some of whom are very unlikely friends for me. And that is not a small feat. I think finding new friends, making new relationships, those things actually matter in peace building. And without peace building efforts on the ground, there's no point in just simply call for abolition of nuclear weapons. Abolition of nuclear weapons, as many of us debated here, does not guarantee peace. So once again, I would like to emphasize the relationships we make through negotiations, collaborations across all levels of society, and big and small, like meeting rooms, are the foundation of hope. And we can find hope in big and small ways in the midst of fear caused by nuclear weapons. Thank you.
You hear him. Thank you to our guests. All right, if I could please ask Tina Cordova, Regis Pecos, and Mariah Gomez to please come up. Pardon me, Tina Cordova and Mariah Gomez, please come up, and Dr. Katie Holzer, please.
Okay, so for this next section, we have two presenters, Tina Cordova, who's the co-founder of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, and Mariah Gomez, my friend, who's an associate professor in the Honors College here at UNM. And I'm just going to do that quick introduction. If you guys want to say more about yourselves as you've been to speak, please do. Tina, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. My name's Tina Cordova. I'm a native New Mexican. I'm a downwinder, the co-founder of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. We're an organization that formed 19 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of being overexposed to radiation. I am a cancer survivor, the fourth generation in my family to have cancer since 1945, and I'll speak about that during my presentation. Thank you for being here. I look forward to sharing our experience with you all.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Gomez, and I'm a faculty member here at the University of New Mexico. I'd like to acknowledge the students in the room. Thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank two of my mentors, both Mr. Regis Pecos, Governor Pecos, and Tina Cordova, who have been not only tremendous mentors to me, but leaders in the New Mexico community. So thank you. Sure, I'll go first. Yeah, I'm not really sure of how we're doing things up here. Okay. I just want to read some prepared comments. What is today called New Mexico was colonized in the late 1500s by Spanish conquistadores in search of the 3 Gs. Gold, God, and glory. They did not find gold as they had predicted, and the leaders of the colonizing expeditions, such as Hernán Cortés, Juan de Oñate, or Diego de Vargas, can no longer be viewed as heroes due to the brutality they enacted on indigenous peoples. But the Catholicism that they brought has mostly persisted. Churches were constructed in every Pueblo community, and indigenous people were forced to convert to Catholicism. It was this early Spanish colonialism that laid the foundation for two later periods of settler colonialism, both American and nuclear. During the US-Mexico War, many battles were waged in New Mexico, and among them, one of the most gruesome was the siege at El Pueblo de Taos. On February 4th, 1847, American military attacked the Catholic Church, setting fire to its roof and eventually forming a hole in the thick adobe walls in order to blast cannons inside the church. Men, women, and children who were trapped inside were murdered, and many who escaped were murdered before nightfall. The implications of both Spanish and American colonialism on the development and destruction of the Catholic Church as both artifact and institution can be easily identified and traced. It is not, however, as clear how nuclear colonialism has had a tangible impact on the Catholic Church. In January 2022, Archbishop John C. Wester announced the impact of nuclear colonialism on the Archdiocese of Santa Fe in his pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. It was the first time that many New Mexicans were confronted with how nuclearism both supports and is supported by the institution of the Catholic Church in New Mexico. Still others asked if this was a throwback to the friars who accompanied the conquistadores in the 1500s. New Mexicans have borne the brunt of nuclear colonialism. Nuclear colonialism is the state-sponsored occupation of indigenous homelands that resulted in the displacement or elimination of indigenous people in favor of preserving a nuclear economy. Nuclear colonialism targets not only indigenous people, but also other ethnic minority groups in poor economic situations that have been disenfranchised because of state occupation of their homelands. New Mexico has been under nuclear occupation since 1943. Nuclear colonialism commenced in the US during World War II when the US established its then-secret Manhattan Project, a multi-site nuclear research and design project that developed the atomic bombs that were used to attack Japan in 1945. It can be categorized as a new mode of imperialism, even though it manifested during wartime and via territorial occupation. It is perpetuated through economic means of government or government policies and practices. After occupying indigenous and Hispanic homelands and black communities as part of the Manhattan Project, US imperial forces expanded their colonial project using existing laws and policies, such as eminent domain, and created new ones. This resulted in a new economic system built around nuclear weapons production. As nuclear energy became more useful for non-weapons production, the nuclear industrial complex grew with it. As the US became a fully operational nuclear industrial complex, every stage of the nuclear production moved within its borders and, more importantly, were located on indigenous homelands, ranging from uranium mining to waste disposal. During World War II, the US government, via President Harry Truman, tasked the Manhattan Project with developing a nuclear weapon that would end the war. The government evicted over 30 Nuevo Mexicano farming families from the Pajarito Plateau and prevented local Pueblo peoples from accessing their homelands. Since then, New Mexico has experienced catastrophic levels of uranium mining, multiple nuclear tests, including the July 16, 1945 Trinity test, and also the 254 radioactive lanthanum tests in Los Alamos between 1944 and 1962, and enormous amounts of legacy waste. Nuclear policymakers have blatantly omitted frontline nuclear communities, which are comprised primarily of indigenous people and people of color. Why aren't they at the table when we discuss the morality of nuclear weapons? This is what we call environmental racism. African-American scholar Benjamin Chavez defines environmental racism as, quote, the racial discrimination in environmental policymaking. It is racial discrimination in the enforcement of regulations and laws. It is racial discrimination in the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the siting of polluting industries. It is racial discrimination in the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of positions and pollutants in communities of color. And it is racial discrimination in the history of excluding people of color from the mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. And I thank our Archbishop John Wester for introducing this conversation, and now I want the Catholic Church to take up environmental racism, to name it, And to do that, the Church should start with addressing the doctrine of discovery, which Pope Francis finally denounced last year. In March 2023, the Vatican issued the joint statement of the Dicasteries for Culture and Education and for Promoting Integral Human Development on the Doctrine of Discovery, which stated, quote, "The Catholic Church therefore repudiates those concepts that fail to recognize the inherent human rights of indigenous peoples, including what has become known as the legal and political doctrine of discovery. This statement concludes that the Church's solidarity with indigenous peoples has given rise to the Holy See's strong support for the principles contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People." It adds, quote, "The implementation of those principles would improve the living conditions and help protect the rights of indigenous peoples as well as facilitate their development in a way that respects their identity, language, and culture." The U.S. bishops and the Catholic Church need to be in dialogue with indigenous communities around the world that have been impacted by the U.S. nuclear weapons complex and other minoritized communities, such as African American communities around the current Savannah River Site new proposal, and Latinx communities in New Mexico and beyond. On December 6th through 8th, 1996, 40 people of color and European American representatives met in Jemez, New Mexico, not in the Pueblo, in the town, for the Working Group meeting on globalization and trade. The Jemez meeting was hosted by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice with the intention of, quote, "hammering out common understandings between participants from different cultures, politics, and organizations." The following Jemez principles for democratic organizing were adopted by the participants. Number 1, be inclusive. Number 2, emphasis on bottom-up organizing. Number 3, let people speak for themselves. Number 4, work together in solidarity and mutuality. Number 5, build just relationships among ourselves. Number 6, commitment to self-transformation. They define inclusivity this way. Quote, if we hope to achieve just societies that include all people in decision-making and assure that all people have an equitable share of the wealth and the work of this world, then we must work to build that kind of inclusiveness into our movement in order to develop alternative policies and institutions to the treaties policies under neoliberalism. This requires more than tokenism. It cannot be achieved without diversity at the planning table, in staffing, and in coordination. It may delay achievement of other important goals. It will require discussion, hard work, patience, and advanced planning. It may involve conflict, but through this conflict, we can learn better ways of working together. It's about building alternative institutions, movement building, and not compromising out in order to be accepted into the anti-globalization club, end quote. As we debate issues of deterrence or disarmament, I feel that we're at an impasse. Pro-deterrence folks don't see or don't care how frontline communities are impacted in the process of building nuclear weapons, and frontline communities don't see or don't care about diplomacy with nuclear weapons-wielding countries. It is impossible to discuss the morality of nuclear weapons without examining first the process of building nuclear weapons and preparing them for use. And to do that would force everyone to confront an over 80-year history of nuclear weapons development and deployment. In December 2017, the Nuclear Issues Study Group organized an event here at the University of New Mexico to bring a more diverse and younger population to the decision-making table. We need more events like that. We cannot stop protesting nuclear proliferation, and I will not stop calling for nuclear abolition. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariah. Tina?
Sure. So for those of you who have heard me speak about this time and again, bear with me. There are a lot of people in this room who've never heard the history of what took place in New Mexico 79 years ago. And we cannot have dialogues about the future of disarmament and deterrence without reconciling with our past. And we have never reconciled with our past. We have a handful of scientists across the country that acknowledge the harm that was done to us in New Mexico. Somebody brought up the Oppenheimer movie earlier. We had this incredible opportunity to spread the word about the truth of what took place in New Mexico after the bomb was detonated at Trinity, and that never happened. Imagine bringing this information for the first time to millions of people all across the world and not starting a dialogue about any part of this. To me, that's the ultimate in ego. And so my point today is to make sure that everybody understands that there is a history that has never been reconciled, and it started right here. And the people of New Mexico, who were simply going about their very, very productive and full lives, was impacted forevermore. We have a Congress that refuses to reconcile that. We have people that continue to tell us that it's going to cost too much to reconcile that. And if you're interested in disarmament, and if you're interested in moving forward with that dialogue, then you have to stand with us against that concept that nothing happened, no one lived here, no one was harmed, because that is absolutely not the truth. And I'm here to tell you about that. Before I move into that history, though, I do want to say that the one place where we have made amazing progress is with the Catholic bishops in the United States. And I have to attribute that to Archbishop Wester. This last year, in the heat of this fight with our Congress to pass the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include for the first time ever, the first people ever exposed to radiation any place in the world, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops wrote a letter of support and made sure that it was hand-delivered to Speaker Johnson's office. And we also had a number of bishops sign on to an additional letter saying, we support the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in this effort to reconcile the past. And again, Archbishop Wester was key to that. And so we have made some progress in this reconciliation that we're seeking. I was raised in a town 45 miles from where the Trinity bomb was detonated. And although our government has said forever that no one lived here and no one was harmed, through this wonderful student here at UNM, this map was produced where we took the 1940 census data and we took every census tract and we laid out all of the population on that map, and then we drew radiuses around Trinity at 10-mile increments. And what we know is that in that first 50-mile radius, there were 13,000 children, women, and men living here. 13,000 living within a 50-mile radius. Far too many people living far too close to where they detonated a bomb. If you take that map and look at the 150-mile radius, that encompasses Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south. It encompasses the Arizona border to the west, and it almost encompasses the Texas border to the east. It's our entire state. And now you're talking about 500,000 people. We weren't warned before or afterwards. Nobody has ever come back. If our government wanted to reconcile, they would have done an epidemiological study of at least one or two of those cities afterwards. But they have never done that because they don't want anything definitive. And what can I tell you about 1945? It was very different than it is today in New Mexico. We didn't have running water. We depended on the rain that fell, and they detonated that bomb on July 16th in between rainstorms during our rainy season when we were charging up our cisterns, when our lakes and our rivers and our creeks were filling up with water. And now our entire water source was contaminated because ash fell from the sky for days afterwards. The government has told us for the better part of 75 years that the radiation fallout went off in a northeasterly direction over the most unpopulated parts of New Mexico, over Clonch and Vaughn. But no radiation went anywhere else. Well, guess what? Last year, a Princeton scientist took today's technology, recreated the blast, and mapped the fallout. Something we always wanted somebody to do. And what did it show? It showed that the fallout stayed over New Mexico for a number of days and then started to disperse and irradiated 46 counties, 46 states, Canada, and Mexico. All of New Mexico was irradiated by the bomb. We also didn't have electricity in New Mexico in 1945, so we didn't have grocery stores. Absolutely everything we ate, we produced ourselves. And now our soil was contaminated. We were maximally exposed, and it's important for people to understand our way of life so that you can understand why we were maximally exposed. And what happened afterwards? Well, we know that in the months right after Trinity, we went from losing something like 30 babies per 1,000 to losing over 100 babies per 1,000. Something, again, our government has never reconciled, never come back to address. Babies were dying. And that number actually is understated. And how do we know? Because we've been collecting data and we've been comparing Catholic church records to the records kept by our state. And we're seeing that in Catholic churches, there were more babies recorded as having died that summer with no death certificates. Why is that? Well, because these babies were born at home. And their births were likely not recorded, so when they died, their families simply buried them and never took the time to record their death either. To not have our government come back in 79 years and do anything to reconcile this is absolutely unconscionable. I mentioned earlier, I'm the 4th generation in my family to have cancer since 1945. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer at the age of 39. First question they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? Now my 23-year-old niece, well, she's 24, but when she was 23, she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And she's had difficulties that I didn't experience. She's had to have further surgery. Her life has been upended. She will never be the same. This is a young lady that wanted nothing more than to go to college, get a degree in art, have a productive life. And so what happens out of that kind of history for us? Well, recently I started thinking, how is Mackenzie different than Demetrius, my oldest grandson, or Marcus, my youngest grandson, or Audrey, my other niece studying art? How is she different? We raised them all the same. What happens is we never stop living wondering who's going to be next in our family. Even our children. We've been collecting health surveys for 17 years. I've read every one of them. We have close to 1,500 of them. People voluntarily wanting their part of this history to be maintained someplace. So their sacrifice and their suffering is never forgotten. And I knew about an extended member of my family who had a granddaughter who had cancer, but he hadn't turned in a health survey. He's done that now. And he wrote about how his 2-year-old granddaughter developed eye cancer. How they took her left eye and now her right eye is at risk. And he lives every day wondering, what will be her future? So what I say today, and I want to thank Governor Pecos, I want to thank you for talking so beautifully about how we can't have these conversations without reflecting on where we've been and what has come out of that for us. Mariah mentioned the uranium mining. We cannot move off this subject matter without recognizing that across the Navajo Nation, Laguna and Acoma Pueblo, they extracted 32 million tons of uranium here, folks. The largest open pit mine is about 35 miles from where you sit today. They're raising children adjacent to it. It's a super fun site. I went to a meeting a few years ago. It was actually a Congressional Senate hearing where I spoke. And the bureaucrats in the room talked about their 10-year plan for addressing that site. We're tired of 10-year plans. We're dying while we're waiting. Our children are getting eye cancer at the age of 2. Have you ever heard of that? That's the legacy of nuclear testing. You don't outlive it and you don't escape it. 32 million tons of uranium, and they've never come back to address those sites. They abandoned them and they used their poverty against them to send them into those mines without proper safety gear. A dust mask, a hard hat, pair of gloves. They didn't even exit at lunch to eat their lunch. They drank the water inside the mines. When I go to Laguna Pueblo, there's nothing but widows there raising children and grandchildren. That's the legacy. That's the legacy that we live with. I will never forgive our government for walking away. We were true American patriots. For those of you who don't know this, during World War II, we have done our share. During World War II, we had more people enlist per capita of any other state in the country. We had more people die than any other state in the country. My grandfather's buried in Belgium. We bought more war bonds than any other state in the country. And we bore this burden, and we continue to bear this burden. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariah Gomez. Thank you, Ms. Tina Cordova. So with this, Dr. Holst will now stay up here, and we're going to invite everyone into some public dialogue. The way we'll do this is Dr. Dan Wolney, the head of the UNM Religious Studies program, and Dr. Becky Serling, my colleague at the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, will have microphones and bring them around. If you'd like to speak, please come to one of the aisles. And each person has time to ask a question or make a statement. Watch the sign up here. It'll go for 2 minutes and then turn yellow. Then you'll have 30 seconds to wrap up. And we'll also bring microphones to anyone from the expert panel who would like to offer thoughts or answer some questions as this goes. Okay, go ahead.
I saw your hand first.
I have been thinking lately about how deterrence only works if it is believed. And that means that we in this country who support maintaining a nuclear arsenal must be willing to end life as we know it on this planet if we are attacked with a nuclear bomb. And I'd like to just ask any of our experts if they have thought about that and why it is that more people in the United States don't realize what we are committing ourselves to by supporting nuclear weapons.
Anyone want to comment? It was certainly a theme during our discussions.
Ira will comment.
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer in large part is that people have convinced themselves this isn't going to happen. We've been living with this for 80 years, and we've sort of got this weird, logically incorrect notion that if it hasn't happened, it won't happen. And what we need to understand is that it really can happen, that this is not some theoretical thing. This is a real danger that we're living with every day. And we also need to understand how catastrophic the consequences will be, which is also generally not understood anymore. Certainly young people have never been educated about what the consequences of nuclear war will be or how likely it is that we're going to have one. And because of that, we're willing, many people, to accept this ongoing risk because we don't understand how great the risk is.
My name is Willard Hunter. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and I'm a Vietnam-era Navy veteran. Back when I was a young man, I created the word viticide, and I think you can figure out what that means. It means basically the death of all life. Now, as an old man, I'm still thinking about viticide. We have done nothing to change that situation. Secondly, Christian Sorensen wrote this quote that was quoted earlier. When war is your business, peace is your enemy. I would paraphrase that to say that when nuclear weapons are your business, peace is your enemy. And the United States, in my opinion, that created nuclear weapons, used nuclear weapons, does not have the right to talk about deterrence. We lost that right.
Thanks, Willard.
I just want to say thank you so much, UNM, for putting on this presentation. All of the speakers, I'm profoundly moved. And I just wish that this could be broadcast on international news. If it is such an important conference, and everyone who has contributed today, the fact that this last year, $91.4 billion was spent on nuclear weapons that could be used for the elimination of COVID and many other diseases, that we're at war, and any moment now we could lose most of the life on Earth. I taught art history at UNM for 20 years. The fact that the Pietà, the Sistine Chapel, all of the contributions of humanity could go up in smoke. This must be addressed, and I thank everyone for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill T. Wald with Veterans for Peace. I'm an associate member. Dr. Theodore Postel, or is it Postel? Not sure exactly how to say his name. He says that when the Russian Sarmat missile, used to be named the Satan missile, which is a MIRV missile, when those are exploded over New Mexico, at least one over each target of Los Alamos and Sandia Lab and the Air Force Base here, and one over the White Sands Mission Range. And probably two will be sent. Each one will have 10 to 15 MIRV warheads inside each missile. The Sarmat Satan missile has either 10 or 15. When each of those weapons at about 1,500 feet above their target, in other words, at least 30 to maybe 90 of those weapons detonate within 1 second, each weapon will reach 180 to 200 million degrees Fahrenheit. So, I would suggest there will be no studs in a house, no grass, no bushes, no trees left in New Mexico and in the surrounding states. But these are also aimed at Amarillo, Denver, Phoenix, and most important, military and city targets in the United States. There will be no infrastructure left in the United States. The people who are not incinerated immediately will suffer greatly because the food supplies will be gone. And the southern hemisphere will suffer, of course, nuclear winter. And that may be the cruelest of all.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Cristian Correa. If nuclear weapons is our business in New Mexico, if nuclear weapons is our business in New Mexico, I think we need to take that into account, how our economy depends on nuclear business, how much we depend our economy on federal funds from the nuclear business. And I think that Ms. Cordova talked very well about the cost of that business, but also we need to talk about the benefits for our economy of that business. So maybe the question is how we could make progress in New Mexico to lower our dependency on this very wealthy business of the subsidies we get from the federal government. And what could be our position as a state if we want to reduce nuclear research and proliferation, what will be our stand for all those New Mexicans who the livelihood depends on this nuclear business?
Thank you, Christian. Want to invite others, and again, idea here is broad points of view, various points of view are welcome.
My name is Yamanas Moram. I'm a professor here. I'm not speaking as a professor, just as an immigrant from I grew up in Eritrea, and I've seen totalitarianism and despotism at its worst. And it's no accident that I'm in this country. We have our problems, but at the end of the day, I can't deny that this is the vanguard for democracy. I know that's not maybe a popular thing to say. To say that somehow we have to disarm, in a sense, assumes equivalency of goodwill between our country and countries like Russia and China. And you know, if there were only two countries in the world, for example, nuclear weapons, let's say South Korea and Japan, I can imagine how easy that would be to negotiate a nuclear deal, because underlying that is two democratic countries. So my worry is that in arguing these points, we sometimes assume that the suffering of other people perpetuated by these other countries is somehow a misunderstanding. And that, in fact, as we approach November 5th, I'm worried for our own country that our democratic tradition, with all its difficulty, may come to an end. And so I don't think nuclear disarmament, to me, is a realistic scenario, given the kind of world we live in. And yeah.
See if there's anybody over here.
And after this speaker, we're going to just pause and invite some of the folks from the expert dialogue to respond to any of this as they choose. Go ahead.
I'll just say, you know, we actually talked a lot about the jobs question, I think, over the last couple of days, and so maybe in particular there might be somebody who could talk about that.
Right. And to address that problem of what we can do with the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry, there's a book that's been written by Timon Wallace. He's from Northampton, and he wrote a book. Well, his organization is called Warheads to Windmills, and towards the end of this month, there's going to be 2 weeks of action against nuclear weapons and also the fossil fuel industry, and they're asking people to go on their website. They put it all together. It's really simple. You can write to your congressman, you can write to the businesses, banks, everybody that's involved in the nuclear industry is being, you know, supported by banks and insurance companies, and all your retirement funds and everything are supporting this industry. And this book, if you go on their website for Warhead to Windmills, you can look it up and you can see that there's a lot of actions that you can do to get this out there in this country. So I just thought I'd let you know.
Hi, my name is Sue Skirman. I'm a member of the Demand Nuclear Abolition grassroots volunteer group based in Albuquerque. I want to acknowledge the protesters outside the Student Union building who are demanding that nuclear weapons be abolished, and the perverse amount of money spent on so-called modernization, that it be spent on urgent human needs such as housing, food, and health care. I also raised the issue that low-income youth of color are pipelined to do the most dangerous jobs of making the plutonium pits at LANL, which is immoral exploitation and part of the nuclear colonialism Dr. Gomez referred to. I asked the organizers why weren't more people of color and frontline indigenous people included on the participant list. Why were yesterday's discussions behind closed doors? And finally, I salute the courage of Dr. Mariah Gomez, Tina Cordova, and Governor Regis Pecos for speaking truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you. I've responded to one piece already regarding how the decision was made to have the first day and a half as closed-door sessions. That had to do with if you want to have people in official positions, you need to, this is a very standard track 2 diplomacy kind of a mechanism. You promise confidentiality so that they can speak frankly and not be perceived as speaking for the institutions where they work or where they have worked. We scheduled the public session precisely in order to pull that closed-door conversation into the public arena and allow a wider conversation with wider participants. Folks were chosen for that conversation based on levels of expertise, proven ability to engage in a kind of back and forth with people of differing views, strongly differing views sometimes, but to do that in a constructive kind of a mode. There's advantages and disadvantages to that approach. There's other events that have included different participants, but that's how this one was set up. Jay Coughlin.
I was a participant, both yesterday and this morning, and I'll try to answer two comments. I can only partially answer them. It won't be entirely satisfactory, but on the issue of jobs, first of all, I would point out that the non-proliferation programs at both Sandia and Los Alamos, I would argue that they should be radically expanded. And applaud if you want, but to carry it on, what we really need are advanced verification and monitoring technologies down to the level of being able to do it for individual warheads to really underpin a future world free of nuclear weapons. Now that's a partial solution to more jobs. A yet bigger one is full comprehensive cleanup at Los Alamos, which, I'm guessing could employ 3 generations of cleanup workers with high-paying jobs for decades. Now, again, these are only partial answers. I'll go to the flip side of where New Mexico is at. DOE is spending $10 billion this fiscal year in the state of New Mexico. 70% of that is for core nuclear weapons research and production programs, and another 5% is for putting the waste from it here, dumping it in our state. At the same time, and I add in contrast, that is 6% more than the operating budget of the entire state government. So you see how disproportionate that is. And what do we have as a result? What we have as a result is that per capita income for New Mexico has declined from being 32nd in 1959 to 47th in 2022. This is counter to all the economic propaganda we hear about how we must have basically a nuclear weapons economy. So again, I've given a partial answer for job creation, but the other part is kind of to New Mexico. Let's go solar, let's go wind, let's grow the renewables, et cetera, and come up with a different economy. Now, I'm switching tracks. This gentleman pointed to the improbability of disarmament, and let me say, I do share that skepticism, and there's going to be nothing easy about it, that's for sure. But first of all, as a bedrock item, already the declared policy of the US government is disarmament as per the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Article 6 mandate to disarm, which the US pledged to in 1970. So basically what I'm saying is, let's live up to stated policy. Let's enter into serious negotiations leading to disarmament, which we pledged to more than a half century ago. Now, unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction, and I know I'm taking up too much airtime, but I want to speak to the special responsibility that we have as New Mexicans.
Jay, I'd like to ask you to move to wrapping up, please.
Yeah, we are the key state. We have a relatively small population. We have greater access to our congressional delegation than virtually anybody else in the country. We should live up to our responsibility and prod our New Mexican delegation to move towards global verifiable disarmament.
I think the dialogue might benefit if someone, and if no one would like to do this, I'll take a shot at it, but there are morally and ethically serious people who make an argument for the ethical policy of deterrence. That deterrence is, in fact, the ethically right thing to do in the contemporary world. Does anybody want to lay out that case very briefly, or do you want me to take a shot at that? Experts?
Well, let's have,
Tina
had a point first. And then.
Sure, go ahead, Tina.
So I talked about the physiological consequences of having been overexposed to radiation, but what I didn't speak about, and this is probably more important when we talk about the economy in our state. New Mexico, even though we are home to 2 national labs and this incredible budget that they have, is the state most dependent on Medicaid of any state in the country. 47% of all the people in New Mexico access health care through Medicaid. And the number would be higher if we enrolled everybody that qualifies, okay? The other thing we have to recognize is New Mexico has a little over 2 million people living here. We are carrying some of the largest medical debt in all of the country. $881 million in medical debt, almost $1 billion in medical debt. Those are not sustainable equations. With the kind of budget that the labs have, we should not be seeing these levels of poverty. How do I know it's linked to our exposure to radiation? Because of those health surveys that we collect. We ask the question on those health surveys, how do you access health care? Inevitably, you know what people mark? Medicaid or Medicare, depending on their age. Because when you're sick and you don't have a job any longer, you can't sustain your job, and you don't have health care, and you live in rural parts of New Mexico, and you have to travel for health care, you end up spending everything you have. And you pass on nothing except medical debt to your family when you die. And these are just facts, folks. This isn't the world according to me. And on every one of those health surveys, when we ask about the financial effects, it is horrible to hear what people say. We hold bake sales and garage sales. Our communities come together to support the families through these things, and that's the legacy of those 2 labs, because if it weren't so, maybe these statistics wouldn't look this way.
Other comments, other questions? Would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Matthew Sharp. I work on arms control issues at the State Department in Washington, and I was one of the government participants in the discussion over the past couple of days. Happy to talk more about deterrence, although very cognizant of the ticking clock. I think, I conceptualize deterrence and the objective of deterrence, and I think this is stated by this administration and previous administrations, in terms of an objective of preventing the kinds of nuclear attacks that some of the speakers have referenced. I think I've listened very closely to the comments of all of the speakers and participants here, and what I hear as a commonality there, very eloquently put in each case, is a common objective, and I think it was a common objective that also was surfaced in the discussions of this expert group yesterday and this morning, and that objective is the peace and security that would come with a world that was without nuclear weapons. I think it's clear to many of us, it's the stated US policy, as Jay said, to pursue that objective. That's where we need to get to. The question I think that prompts is how. How do we go from where we are now to that, I think very difficult to argue against, end state? And I think we had a lot of very diverse perspectives, different frameworks for approaching those questions in this small room, and I commend the organizers for assembling those perspectives. There were other perspectives that were not there, and I think the other thing that was not in that room was the answer. And so I guess the point that I really want to inject, we're here at a university, there are some students here in the audience, we do need help. We need people who are the smartest people that we have, with the boldest ideas and the most creativity to help answer the question, not of where we need to go to, we know that, but how do we get there? And so I really want to invite you to participate, the NGO community, the academic community, the communities of faith. These are incredibly important, but come and work at the State Department. Come and work at the Department of Energy. Work for the Department of Defense. We need these voices in all of these places if we're going to be able to tackle what is really a truly complicated, but couldn't be a more important challenge. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp. Yep. Christopher Ford. And please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much. My name is Chris Ford. I was also one of the participants in these discussions and delighted to have the chance to have this follow-on with all of you. And just to second what my colleague from the State Department said, I'm no longer in government. I'm just a professor these days. But I'm at least one of those people who does believe that we do have a moral obligation to try, if we can, to deter war, to prevent aggression and the evils that entails. Just as we also have a moral obligation to move, hopefully ever steadily forward to a world with fewer and fewer nuclear risks. The hard part is doing those two things at the same time in a context in which negotiating our way with other partners who don't share our perspectives, or probably the perspectives of anyone in this room, on exactly how the world is or should work. How do we get all of those other partners in a place where they're willing to have discussions and to agree to things and to implement things that get us to the place that we would ultimately like to be? I don't know the magic answer to that question. I do know that it's incredibly hard. And I have heard a lake of passion here and commitment and concern for the future of humanity and all these issues. And that's not right. It's an ocean, not a lake, right? What we don't yet have is an equivalent volume of practical, thoughtful solutions that offer ways to do this. And so take that passion and use this as a catalyst to help find ways forward. And those ways forward involve necessarily engaging with people who have different perspectives on these very same issues than you do. Don't demonize them. Don't think, and this goes to people from both sides of the perspective, right? I go back to talk to people on my team in Washington, and there are lots of folks who need to hear this go in the other direction, right? So this is a two sides of the aisle critique. But don't approach this with the moralistic finger in the face. Approach this as a way to have the kind of dialogue that we're having now, that this group has had so commendably over the last couple of days in necessary confidentiality, and try to use that spirit and the energy of that passion to drive towards real workable solutions. Because that is morally important, right? I mean, ought implies can. If you can't identify a path forward, it's very hard to argue that there is a moral obligation to take that non-existent path. So if you want this to be a moral destination, provide a viable path to that solution. Work with all of us to figure that out, because if you can't do that, I don't know what to do then. That's the really terrifying thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Other thoughts, other questions?
Is that Frank?
Back here.
I'm Frank Yates. I'm just here. And I understood that there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons earlier in a presentation. And I guess my real question is, the United States has an official policy of disarmament. And I'm wondering, of the other countries that have nuclear weapons, have any of them voiced a desire for disarmament?
Good question. Matthew Sharp, you might be best to take that on, unless somebody else would like to take that on.
Thanks. Actually, I think almost all of our experts are very well suited to answer this question as well as I am. Of the states with nuclear weapons, there are 5 that are recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the treaty that Jay mentioned earlier. wherein our own 1970 commitment to this objective is enshrined. Those 5 are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. And so those 5 nuclear weapon states all have the same sets of obligations and all the same commitments that have stemmed from the 50 years of implementation of that treaty. When you talk to, they're probably non-government answers that are very relevant for the second part of your question, which is what about the states that are not in the NPT? And I think there is an understanding from countries like Pakistan and India. These are states that became nuclear armed after the NPT. They share those objectives. They talk about them in different ways. I think the obligations are different. They aren't members of the same treaty structure. But I think the consequence of the challenge for the United States and for those other 4 nuclear weapon states within the NPT is to engage broadly, because I think there is an appreciation for the fact that disarmament with only the states that say that that's okay with them, leaving out others that are nuclear armed, probably isn't a viable pathway.
Before we go on to another question, any of the other expert folks want to comment on that? Okay. Sure, yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Dr. James O'Sullivan. I am a professor of social ethics at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And just to add to what Dr. Sharp just said, I think that I want to, and several of my other colleagues have noted, I really want to reemphasize the critical importance of everyone in this room as part of civil society to assist our government, which does have good intentions, but which is stymied in many ways by a very complex reality in the world today. And so it is therefore incumbent upon all of us in this room who agree that something needs to be done to discern how we can do something in assistance, right? And to cross not just boundaries between faiths and different beliefs within this country, but between countries, right? And to begin dialogues in an ever more robust manner such that we really can have a critical mass of citizens that is demanding from elements of recalcitrance in the government that something further be done, right? And only when there's that type of political support can people in the State Department, et cetera, have a further backing to undertake their own tasks. So again, everyone in this room has a role. The question is how you discern it.
And then an observation. Oh, sorry. Ira, are you going to address this? Yeah.
I hate to be contrarian, but I have to say there is a legal obligation on the 5 countries, United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, to seek the elimination of their nuclear arsenals. I don't think any of these countries at this point are committed to doing that, and that includes the United States. And I think that's where the role of civil society is so important. I think that no one in the United States government wants to have a nuclear war, but I think that the United States government, like the other countries that have nuclear weapons, are somewhat addicted to their nuclear arsenals. These weapons do not exist solely to deter nuclear war, as we are asked to believe. The United States explicitly has nuclear weapons, according to its own official documents, to be able to fight a nuclear war, to have a nuclear war fighting capability, to be able to project its strength, its power around the world. And that's what the other nuclear weapons do too. I'm not citing the United States as the problem. This is what all of them, I think, have bought into. Nuclear weapons have become like the ring of power in the Tolkien books. The countries that have them do not want to give up this power. And I think we need to push them to be willing to do that. And the stated policy is one thing. The actual actions of the governments are something quite different. And I just think we need to understand that as well.
I'm just going to go to, is this about this, Chris? Okay.
Sorry, I guess if I'm being contrarian to a contrarian, I'm being positive, right? So I'm going to be positive and point out that in fact, Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty obliges all the signatories, and not just the nuclear weapon states, but all the signatories, to pursue negotiations in good faith towards well, ending the arms race and disarmament and so forth. So the problem with pursuing negotiations is you have to have someone who negotiates with you. And I can certainly say from my time in government, and I suspect Dr. Sharp would say the similar thing about more recently in government, we have worked very hard to try to get, in particular the Russians and the Chinese, to sit down and talk with us about precisely these kinds of ways forward. What can be conceptualized that might actually work? What are they willing to talk about? The problem so far is that they haven't been willing to sit down and have that conversation with us. We have pursued negotiations in good faith. Their answer has been crickets. Now, I suggest there's a powerful civil society role that can be played here. If you have contacts in either of those countries, if you have people who know people in those countries, right? The leaders who are refusing our efforts to talk to them are precisely leaders who, by the nature of their government, are not particularly listening to civil society. I don't know how to fix that, but if you can help with this, if we can speak of a voice that not just urges them to come to the table as their leaderships, but urges them to give their civil societies a voice in nuclear-related politics, just like you have here today, that would be an amazingly better world. That's a practical step forward that I'd love to see. Thanks.
Okay, I have a real quick. Okay.
Chris is quite right that the Article 6 of the NPT requires the countries not just that have nuclear weapons, but all countries to engage in good faith negotiations. And in fact, 122 countries came together at the United Nations and engaged in just those negotiations in 2017 and adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, the United States has had difficulty bringing Russia and China to the table, but it has not had difficulty bringing them and Britain and France together in opposition to this negotiation. This is one thing that the P5 seem to find that they can agree on, that they hate this treaty, that they do not want to work with it. They do not want, I don't call for the United States to sign the treaty until it works out an arrangement with the other countries that have nuclear weapons. But these countries have made a firm decision they will not even be part of this conversation. And I think that really calls into question their commitment to eliminating nuclear weapons. The Trump administration went so far as to say that the United States will never sign this treaty, even if the other nuclear weapons do. Nuclear weapon states do.
Dan, let's go to John. Oh, he doesn't have his hand up. John, son Nicholas, my student. Do you still have a question?
And then Katie and Rich, we're waiting over here.
Okay. Yeah, I did have wanted to start with a remark and then end with an open-ended question for the experts here. As a student, as an American, as someone who's very deeply committed to my generation, I really fear for our country as to the decay of democratic values and democratic participation we've had among Americans. And I really feel that if we do want to see change, oftentimes it's the people who've been most affected by oppression, by suffering, who have the best insights as to how to address those issues. And so I really am speaking back to what Dr. Mariah Gomez and what Tina have said about including more voices at the table. But also as someone who's come from immigrant families, from low-income families, poverty is one of the things that keeps people from being able to educate themselves, from being able to empower themselves, to care about those issues and to act towards those issues. Oftentimes they're encumbered by meeting the bare necessities of life to do that. And I didn't really think of how poverty was connected to the nuclear economy until just now. And so if any experts want to talk to you about how we can address that connection, because once we can empower the communities in New Mexico, New Mexicans, they do care about this country. And if we can make life livable, then I do think that we would be able to have the people have a voice in what the government does and says. Because until then, it'll only be open to the people who can afford to care and can afford to participate in the democracy. But democracy should not be something that has an affordability line that so many people are below.
Let's go. I saw Carl Caves, and then we'll come over here.
Does anyone want to speak to John's question first? Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
Could okay.
Carl Caves, and then I saw here, and then we'll come here. Okay.
Okay. Carl, you're.
Hi, my name is Carl Caves. As Rich indicated, I'm a theoretical physicist, retired professor of physics and astronomy at the university. Sorry, I have a hard time talking. Perhaps it's because I'm from Oklahoma. Anyway, my name's Carl Caves. I'm a theoretical physicist, retired professor of physics and astronomy here at UNM. So I have a question. It's not really a question, it's kind of a statement which is directed at this question. Is our government, does it have any commitment whatsoever to ultimate nuclear disarmament? And I would say no, and the current evidence for that is we have a program to modernize our land-based ICBM force called the Sentinel program, which is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, total waste of money, which is going to end up modernizing a piece of the nuclear triad that we do not need, even if you accept the logic of deterrence, and which, because the land-based component must be on hair-trigger alert because somebody can wipe it out in a flash, actually makes us more unsafe. Now, if our government cannot recognize that this is a bad idea, then they have no commitment to nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
We've got two people on this side, so you're first, and then you.
My name is Dennis McCarthy. I'm a retired physician scientist, and I just have two questions. This has been a magnificent discussion, but it's very narrowly focused on nuclear disarmament, and it seems to me that there are some peripheral issues that are very related, and one of them is the moral issue of a sort of principle of double effects question, which is, by focusing on nuclear disarmament, are we in danger of legitimizing conventional warfare? So that's the first question. And the second question is that nuclear weapons are a major tool of wending power. And as Machiavelli says, power is always seized, it is never given. And it seems to me that there must be some careful consideration of power plays in dealing with this problem. Not only power plays internationally of asking nations to give up power, but also within our own nation. 40% of the defense budget goes to 5 corporations in America. And as Mussolini pointed out, we're in danger of corporate control of the means of governance. And so I hope that the people who were involved in the discussion have given some careful consideration to giving up power and also to the danger of legitimizing conventional warfare, which we've all been struggling with to an appalling degree for the last year, looking at the genocidal activities in Palestine and so on. So conventional warfare is also a very bad thing. So in seeking the good, we must not foster the bad.
Dr. Holster and I up here are wondering if maybe either Cardinal McElroy or Michael Desch would be interested in responding to the first question about if in pursuing nuclear disarmament narrowly, are we at risk of credentialing, legitimizing conventional war? Either of you?
Or both.
Or both, yeah.
Well, thank you for your observations. You said a lot of very important things. I'm quite frankly worried about what you describe. I'm somebody who believes that nuclear weapons, with all the dangers they present and all the costs and all the follow-on effects on local communities, nonetheless have reinforced deterrence. And the history of the 21st century is an unfortunate upward climb in the costs of major great power wars. Fortunately, we didn't have a World War III, and I think nuclear deterrence played some part in that. Maybe not the only factor, and it wasn't perfect, but it was peace of a sort, which Pacem described way back in Vatican II. I've been sitting up here looking at this sign, when war is your business, peace is your enemy, thinking about the issue, why do states get nuclear weapons? And they get nuclear weapons for a lot of reasons, and I'll be the last one to deny that what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex doesn't play some role in it. But you think of the 9 nuclear powers who are out there, why do they have nuclear weapons? You go to Russia and say, you ought to denuclearize. You'll be talking to people where the historical memory of the Second World War, when that country suffered at least 20 million dead, is still a living part of political discourse. Now, does President Putin play on that? Yeah, but it's also a reality. If you were to go to Israel, a non-declared nuclear weapons state, and say you really ought to give up your nuclear arsenal that you're not willing to talk about, you will get a lecture about the Holocaust and about the War of Independence. And again, people, political entrepreneurs can manipulate it. But
20 seconds, Michael, please.
At root, there's a sense of strategic necessity. It's going to be, you have to overcome that or people aren't going to be serious about disarmament.
Real quick, Cardinal McElroy, did you want to say anything to that?
I just think there's a continuum of warfare, and nuclear warfare is one element of this. And partly there's a psychological continuum and a geopolitical continuum of warfare. And I think that's what you were pointing to. I think that is the reality, that in focusing on this, we seem to say, well, the other is so much better that it's more acceptable. And I agree that's a problem. But I do think there's a distinctiveness to the destructiveness of nuclear war, the cataclysmic potential, that it has a moral category sui generis, really, in warfare. But I think the temptation you're talking about, or the slippery slope, is really, truly there. And that's why whenever the Vatican has spoken upon this, it is talked about as a continuum. That is, when you look at the Second Vatican Council or the statements of the popes on these questions, it is all linked together as an evil in humanity, partly because of the damage to economies, to the environments, to communities that go into the warfare, and there are the consequences of warfare. So I think it is a continuum, it is a slippery slope, but I do think there's a distinctive element and category for the challenge to rid ourselves of nuclear weapons and begin to move urgently in that direction.
Thank you. Paul Ingalls, or whoever the question was here.
Hey, I want to thank all the panelists. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate hearing your views. And personally, I would have been very interested to hear the pro-nuclear side. So my question is, why weren't there panelists who had a different view, a pro-nuclear view?
Anybody want to comment? Yeah.
Hi. Actually, there are a couple of questions that have not quite been answered, so maybe I'll just touch on a couple of those. I don't think I'm a pro-nuclear perspective on the panel. I don't think there was a pro-nuclear perspective reflected in our discussions. If by pro-nuclear the meaning is, or the interpretation should be, pro a conflict with nuclear weapons that would have devastating humanitarian consequences. I think there were probably a dozen different frameworks and perspectives reflected in the discussion. Some of those were a lot less familiar to me than the policy, defense, security perspective, but none of them suggested that the right objective here is status quo, or that the right objective is a framework that could, in fact, result in the use of nuclear weapons in conflict. Another point, to skip just quickly, the question was, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your second question, the last questioner, the likelihood of conventional conflict, but also you had a second one there. I apologize.
Did you have a second question? No, I think he's talking about yours.
Dennis, your second question, quickly.
Yeah, my second question was, to what extent the solution of the nuclear problem depends on a very broad consideration of power as a dimension in the solution of the problem. Not only international power, which has to be forsaken, but also capitalist power in America, which is very vested in the nuclear industry. I mean, when we give $60 billion to Ukraine, not a dollar leaves the US. What we have is $60 billion going to US businesses, and the arms are exported.
Okay, thank you. I think that gives him the chance to answer.
So no, thank you for that. I apologize for making you repeat yourself. I do worry that if the framework is that disarmament involves giving up power, then we could be in a lot of trouble. But I wouldn't articulate it that way, I think, and that's not the way it's articulated in the framework of the NPT. I think that we, the United States, and the international community as a whole, realize that the commitments and obligations inside the NPT, which are not only the one that was cited relevant to nuclear disarmament, but also non-proliferation obligations to avoid the spread of nuclear weapons to countries that don't have them now, that those objectives are very much in our national security interests. And I think we do this not to give up power, and not as a favor to anyone, but because it's the right thing to do for our own security interests. It keeps our own people safer and more secure. We benefit from that world. And I think the comment before that was sort of questioning, well, is that really our policy? You know, I can say that it's our policy to pursue a world without nuclear weapons. It means a lot more when President Biden says it, as he did in a statement in 2022. But I think it's fair to ask, well, what have you done towards that end? And I won't try to lay that out here for the sake of time, but we just met with the nearly 190 countries who are parties to the NPT in Geneva the last month. And the United States laid out there at some length a case for here's how we understand the commitments that we've undertaken in this area, and here's what we've done over the past decades to that end. And so it's available on the internet. It was an address to other NPT parties, but it's publicly available, and I would commend it to you. And then last, John asked a really good question about inclusivity that I didn't want to leave unanswered. I think you framed it in the perfect way, that there's a diversity of perspectives here, and one of the dimensions of that inclusivity is generational. And so you premised that, you posited that all voices, including those generational voices, should be included at the table, and I think that's exactly right, and it's on us to include that, and there are a variety of ways. My bureau sponsors what we call the Jim Timby Forum every year, and we'll do it again this fall, that is intended exactly at that audience to make sure that there's a dialogue and an opportunity to engage. I would suggest you look at that, but I would also suggest that you not take no for an answer, that you find your way to the table, you force your way to the table. We need people to not wait to be asked, but to come forward. And then I would repeat myself just a little bit, that if being at the table means engaging with policymakers, that is important and great, but it's not sufficient. We need you also to be a policymaker.
Thank you. I'm Paul Ingalls. I'm the co-producer of Peace Talks Radio, nationally distributed program on peacemaking and nonviolent conflict resolution. Most of our staff is here today. And we generally create programs, by the way, on the air at KUNM 8 a.m. Tuesday mornings. We create programs looking for solutions that are being tried to end conflict, and then we try to elevate those solutions that are being tried. And the thing that is a little curious about me that I haven't heard a lot about today is that in these expert discussions, and we've heard from individual points of view, I really long to hear over the course of the last couple of days, were there moments where people in the room could kind of nod together and even hear the germ of an idea that would be moving us closer to this, like, yeah, I think we can all agree on that. And so are there any experts here that, can maybe enlighten us to where there was a little bit of consensus going on in the discussion? That would be great. The other thing, and even though I'm flattered by the invitation to all of us to, if we can have, if we have any solutions to any of these problems, that's nice. I'm flattered by that, but I also know I really couldn't help out in the COVID crisis. I do count on experts who spend their life and times to study these issues to really come to the table and work toward compromise. So I'm interested in the solutions parts that may have emerged, even to the slightest degree, in the last couple of days.
Great question.
That's a great question.
It's actually a good segue.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our closing piece of the program today, is to hear from the visiting experts, closing thoughts, out of the dialogue, out of the experience, anything that you'd like to get on the table. But let's start with thoughts in response to Paul Ingalls' question. I don't think there was a lot of consensus on solutions, but were there at least areas in which convergence of views happened in ways that might be productive for the future? Thoughts on that?
I think Marianne wanted to say something.
I think there was convergence of views of the need for nuclear safety and security. There was convergence of views about the needs for more jobs and the importance of the labs, that they could provide opportunities to make those arsenals safer and to provide new ways to look at diminishing those arsenals. There was a variety of viewpoints. Somebody asked why there wasn't a pro-nuclear. There were many who were arguing very full-heartedly in favor of nuclear energy, in favor of the nuclear labs, some who were arguing, like Michael, in favor of nuclear deterrence, different questions about how many weapons, what larger numbers would be or smaller numbers would be. So I think there were a wider variety of voices around the table on those issues, but definitely the needs for safety and security while we continue to try to grapple with these issues. The other thing, in response to your question about conventional warfare, we do know a lot about how to reduce conventional warfare, and we have done a lot to reduce conventional warfare. We know that countries are typically inclined to be trapped in these cycles of violence when they have declining economies, when they have had a history of warfare in the past 5 years, when they have a youth bulge, when they have reliance on natural resources and minerals. My colleague Jerry Powers just released a book on conflict and natural minerals. And so the good news is we've seen lots of countries be able to grow their economies, provide jobs for their youth, increase education in ways that got them out of that conflict trap. And I think those are things that are translatable to our discussion here. So when I was saying that there's ways out of conflict, we've had lots of countries get rid of their nuclear arsenals or get rid of their programs to develop nuclear weapons, to roll back those. One of my colleagues here, the other Dr. Loves, worked a lot on those countries that have given up their arsenals. And those are positive examples that we can look to going forward.
Before we go on, just any other comments on areas of sort of emerging consensus, maybe too strong a word, but emerging shared insight? Yeah. Hans and then Jay.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm a foreigner. I used to be a foreigner. I grew up in, I'm a foreigner, or I was a foreigner. I grew up in Europe. I started in this work. My name is Hans Christensen. I work with the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. We count nukes around the world, report on it, and what's the status of modernization programs. When you hear numbers out there or read in newspapers, most probably come from what we put out over the years. But this is an organization, of course, that has its roots in this area because the scientists that developed the bomb, they created this federation of atomic scientists at the time. But when you ask about consensus, in this very diverse group of people, it's a low bar, but of course, the real consensus that did exist was of the utmost importance of trying to prevent the use of nuclear weapons in some shape or form, trying to prevent that. This enormous accomplishment that since the dropping of the weapons on Japan in 1945, there has not been any use of nuclear weapons in anger. We've had lots of nuclear tests with the consequences that we've heard about. Thank you very much for speaking to that. But that's a consensus. But Where the views differed was more about how do you go about ensuring that. And so while there was a lot of discussion about disarmament, the end goal, and how do we get there, I also urge you to think about, while we think about how to get to that, how do we respond, how do we think about the role that nuclear weapons should have today? Because there is a debate about that. There is an international development right now underway, great power competition, that is strongly shaping the way we're talking about the role of nuclear weapons. Do we need more? Do we need better? Is that the right way to respond to this development or not? What are the alternatives? Things like that are really, really important. I think that you participate in that debate and have some great ideas.
Jay Coughlin.
This is brief, and I'm responding to that guy's question. He's not looking, but was there any common ground? And this is, I don't want to get your hopes up because this is a really low bar. But there was still recognition of what I said earlier. It's still the official policy of the United States government to work towards nuclear disarmament as it pledged to in the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that was unanimously recognized as still the official policy. Now, behind that, as Hamlet said, there's the rub. How are we doing that? The current enthusiasm of the U.S. government to actually do so, and other factors, widely divergent views. So as I said, this was a very low bar for unanimous opinion.
Could I venture a tentative, another area of what felt to me like some emerging consensus, but I might be wrong on this. I thought, to a great degree, a lot of the kind of national policy level thinkers found it pretty revelatory to hear detailed sense for the impact of nuclear weapons production on communities and persons in New Mexico. And at least the beginning of a sense that whatever you think the right solution is, those solutions need to be more accountable to the actual impacts in local communities. I might be wrong about that, but I think there was some sense, wow, that's to be taken seriously.
Is this my mic? I speak better if I just stand. Okay. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a tribal member of the Laguna Pueblo. I am a peacemaker and a poet. I'm also a keeper of the 7 generations. War is not the answer. Have you ever heard a child scream with terror in war? A baby screaming with terror. That is what war does. That is what weapons making does and contributes to. War is war against children, innocent children and their families. The solution to this nuclear issue, this is going to sound simple, but why not? You don't have to be a nuclear physicist to know what to do and what is right or wrong. Disarmament deterrence is not the answer. The dangerous world is what we're making it. Not me, but those who are partaking in weapons making, especially nuclear. We've got a huge global mess. The nuclear issue began in New Mexico and is now a global issue, and there's a big mess everywhere. Messes. And it must end where it began. Right now, right here in New Mexico. Okay? And we can do this only together. Jobs? Really? Oh, yeah, they're going to lose jobs. Well, a few, like the Llano, San Diego, they get the biggest chunk of money in a small area compared to the rest of New Mexico.
30 seconds, please.
Oh, you're timing me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. There is a point where, yes, policy, the government, laws upon laws, crooked laws, twisted laws, it's an entanglement of time. The space-time entanglement is here. We can undo this together. But first, there are too many.
Please wrap up.
There are too many in leadership that do not belong there.
Please wrap up.
You must have seventh generation. How much time do we have? I don't even know. I'm sorry.
So
I'm on Indian time.
Everybody has had 2 minutes. You've had 2.5 minutes. Please wrap up. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you must have seventh generation thinking in every decision you make, be it law, whatever position you're in, and think of the children first.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we've finished the public dialogue portion of this. The last half hour, as on the published schedule, is a chance for the visiting guests to just offer closing thoughts. I'd like to move to that piece of the schedule. Just, are there closing thoughts, either other areas of, perhaps not consensus, but emerging insight that have come up, or other thoughts in response to the comments that have been made? Yeah, James?
I think I can go so far as to speak for everyone that there is consensus certainly on all of us being enormously grateful. It was a great privilege to be a part of this conversation, and on the agreement that we've all made, as Hero pointed out earlier, we've all made new friends and new connections. Right? This has been a tremendously important dialogue, but it is only the beginning of the dialogue. And I think it's very fitting that the end of the dialogue ends with opening it to the public, because only when it is truly at myriad levels of all sorts of levels of society, an ongoing dialogue, will we make further progress on this. So I think I would be right to say that all of us got a lot out of this, and all of us have a lot of things that we are now further informed about, and further connections have been made, and I think that's a very hopeful thing indeed. And again, I think we are all grateful for that.
Any other last thoughts from visiting guests? Okay, with that, I think let's move to close. I do want to thank some people. In particular, I would like to thank Archbishop Takami from Nagasaki and Governor Regis Pecos from Cochiti Pueblo. Both of them, for invoking the spirit, whatever that spirit is that you believe in, of God or goddess or the human quest for some better life, the ethical spirit of humanity, whatever that means to you. I hope you could hear that in their invocations out of their own traditions. I want to thank the subdirector and staff for having us here, sound, all those people. This is on behalf of Dr. Katie Holscher and I as the primary sponsors, and Dr. Dan Wolney as the primary sponsor of this event. This came together as an event of the University of New Mexico Religious Studies Program, the Endowed Chair of Catholic Studies, and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of California. It's a collaboration across religiously rooted thinkers and secularly rooted thinkers, different universities, providing a space that hopefully is a conversation that can be ongoing and to reshape the debate over time. Dr. Becky Serling, my colleague from the University of Southern California, has been central to all of this. And most of all, two groups, our visiting guests, the kind of intense conversation we've had over the last couple days, the frankness, the sharpness of exchange sometimes, but also the spirit of finding a way to hear other points of view, understand other points of view, and begin to think more deeply, continuing to think deeply about how we prevent a kind of nuclear Armageddon that not only destroys human civilization, but destroys our common home, in Pope Francis's phrase. That is, the ecosystems that support all of life. And lastly, thank you to everybody in the room for a diverse set of viewpoints, not just your own, but out of your communities, your places of origin, your training. It's not an easy conversation. It's not over, but it's really an important one going forward. So let's wrap up here. Thank you very much for being here.